If tonight you can't sleep, if your heart is heavy with fear, shame, or exhaustion, if your bank account is empty and your soul feels just as dry, please pause for a moment, not to try harder, not to figure everything out, not even to pray for a miracle. Just listen. This is the story of a man who lost everything: his job, his home, his pride. And somewhere between the silence and the hunger, he found something unexpected: God. Not in the form of a sudden breakthrough, but in a quiet presence that sat with him on the cold pavement of rock bottom. He thought he needed money. He thought he needed rescue. But what he needed most was someone who would not walk away. He didn't think it would happen to him. People like Mark always had a plan, a spreadsheet, a safety net. He was the kind of man who balanced his checkbook, paid his bills early, packed his lunch to save money, and built a 6-month emergency fund because every financial blog said to. He had done everything right until everything collapsed. It started with the layoffs. He had seen the signs: his company downsizing quietly, budgets tightening, co-workers disappearing with little explanation. But still, when his name showed up on the list, something inside him broke. His position was no longer needed. His skills were no longer aligned with strategic direction. His identity was no longer secure. At first, he told himself it would be temporary. He updated his resume, applied for jobs, woke up at 6 a.m., like always, dressed for interviews even if they were just on Zoom. But weeks passed, then months. Savings drained, credit cards filled, the fridge emptied. And he started to realize this wasn't just about money. This was about worth, about failure, about waking up every morning and wondering if you still mattered when you couldn't provide anything anymore. His friends didn't know what to say. His parents offered advice, but it came with an edge of shame. And the silence of rejection emails became louder than the noise of the world outside. Eventually, he stopped applying. He stopped shaving, stopped answering texts, stopped hoping. And then one Thursday morning, in early winter, with just $4.32 left in his bank account, he packed a small bag, locked the door to his apartment, and walked away. He didn't even know where he was going. All he knew was that he had nothing left: no savings, no backup plan, no idea what he was supposed to do next. He slept that night in the back corner of a 24-hour laundromat, head on his backpack, stomach growling, heart numb. And as he stared at the blinking red light of a soda machine in the darkness, one thought floated to the surface: God, if you're real, now would be a good time to show up. But no voice came. No light. No miracle. Just the hum of dryers and the ache of failure pressing deep into his ribs. He didn't know it then, but that moment, when everything felt lost, was the exact place God had been waiting to meet him. Not to fix everything, but to sit beside him in the silence, in the hunger, in the shame, and to whisper gently, "You still matter to me." Mark woke the next morning to the sound of quarters clinking into a washer. He blinked. His neck ached from the position he'd slept in. His fingers were cold. Outside, the sky was gray and low, pressing winter into the city like a quiet weight. He sat up, tried to straighten his hoodie, and looked around. An older man across the laundromat gave him a glance. Not harsh, not pitying, just noticing. Mark looked away. He didn't want to be seen. Not like this. He walked out into the morning, his backpack over one shoulder, hands deep in his pockets. He had $4.32 left and no appetite, just thirst and shame. There was a gas station down the block. He wandered in, hoping to buy the cheapest coffee they had, something hot to hold, even if it tasted like burnt plastic, as he stood in line with his paper cup, counting coins in his palm. Someone behind him tapped his shoulder. Mark turned. It was a woman, maybe in her 60s. Hair pulled back, eyes kind. "Don't turn around mad," she said. "But let me get that for you." He opened his mouth to decline, but nothing came out. She handed a few crumpled bills to the cashier before he could speak, smiled at him gently. Her hands were weathered, the kind that had held sorrow before. "God's been good to me," she said. "Let me pass a little of that on." And just like that, she was gone. Mark stood there frozen, holding coffee he hadn't paid for, heart caught in his throat. He stepped outside and sat on the curb. Steam rose from the cup, curling into the air like a prayer. He hadn't prayed in months, not since before the layoffs. But something about this moment, a stranger's kindness, the quietness of it, felt like a door had creaked open, tiny, unremarkable, but undeniably there. He whispered, almost to the air, "I'm still here, not with pride, not with bitterness, just with honesty." And somehow, that admission felt holy. The coffee warmed his hands. The kindness warmed something else, not hope exactly, but a crack in the numbness, a flicker. He didn't have a home. He didn't have a plan. But he had one quiet truth rising in his chest. Maybe God hadn't walked away. Maybe he'd just been waiting until Mark was still enough to feel him. That night, Mark didn't return to the laundromat. Instead, he found a corner bench outside a closed church downtown. It was tucked under a small awning, mostly shielded from the wind. The church was plain. Red bricks, a wooden cross above the doorway, and a fading sign that read, "You are not alone." He wasn't sure if it was a church slogan or a message from someone who had once believed those words. Either way, something in them tugged at him. Not loudly, just enough. He sat down, pulled his hoodie tighter around his ears, and watched his breath rise into the night air. The church doors were locked, but the building still felt safe. There was no sermon, no choir, no warm pews. But somehow, he felt closer to God sitting there in the cold than he ever had in years of church attendance. He thought about the woman at the gas station, the way she didn't ask questions, didn't tell him to get a job, didn't judge his unshaven face or the shame he wore like a second coat. She simply gave and disappeared. Was that what grace looked like? He didn't know how to pray anymore. Not the proper way. He used to bow his head, close his eyes, say the right words, wait for the right result. But now, he just stared at the darkened windows of the church and said quietly, "If you're here, thank you." It wasn't polished. It wasn't long. But it was real. And something in the night felt warmer afterward. The wind picked up. Mark leaned against his backpack, trying to get comfortable. A distant siren wailed somewhere beyond the buildings. A dog barked. Then silence again. And just before sleep claimed him, a thought slipped into his heart. Not forced, not from his own mind. He was sure of that. "You are not forgotten." It wasn't audible, not like thunder, more like stillness. But it was there, and it wrapped itself around him more tightly than the hoodie ever could. He closed his eyes, not with dread this time, but with the faintest sliver of peace, the kind that doesn't come from having answers, but simply from knowing you are not alone. The next morning, Mark woke to footsteps. He blinked through the haze of half-sleep and early dawn, the sky barely touched with pink. The city was just beginning to stir. Delivery trucks humming in alleyways, pigeons shuffling near trash bins, and a few tired souls walking with shoulders hunched against the cold. One of them approached him, a man, maybe in his 50s, bearded, rough coat, face weathered like bark. He didn't say much, just nodded, then held something out. A thick wool blanket, worn but clean, folded neatly. "Someone gave it to me last night," the man said. "Figured you might need it more." Mark stared at it for a moment, stunned. "Why?" The man shrugged, stepping back. "We all got nothing. Might as well share the nothing." Then he walked off, whistling low under his breath. Mark sat there for a while, fingers pressed into the fabric, blinking too fast. He wasn't used to this kind of giving. Not transactional, not charity, just human. There was no pride left in him to resist it, no ego to defend. He accepted the gift like a starving man would accept bread, even if he hadn't realized how cold he'd been until warmth touched him. He wrapped the blanket around himself, leaned back against the stone wall of the church, and let the quiet settle over him again. This wasn't where he had planned to be at 39. He had dreams once, business ventures, travel, a wife, maybe kids. He had wanted to be the man others looked up to, not the one sleeping on church steps, whispering prayers like lifelines into the air. But those dreams had died quietly, not with explosions, but with disappointments, delays, and 1,000 little paper cuts of failure. And yet, there, wrapped in someone else's sacrifice, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had nothing by the world's standards, but he was beginning to suspect he might be standing at the edge of something far deeper. Is this what surrender feels like? Not defeat, not despair, but the slow loosening of a grip he hadn't even realized he'd clenched all his life. He looked up at the fading stars and whispered words he didn't expect. "Okay, God, I'll stop pretending I can fix it." There was no answer, no flash of divine reply, but inside him, something shifted. A quiet exhale, a release, and the city's noise didn't seem so loud anymore. He didn't know where he'd go next. But for the first time in weeks, he didn't dread the next step. He wrapped the blanket tighter, stood up, and began to walk, not toward a plan, but toward the one who'd been walking beside him all along. The shelter was smaller than he expected. No glowing cross out front. No choir singing hymns. Just a brown brick building tucked between a pawn shop and a faded barber pole, with a handwritten sign in the window that said, "Hot meals at 6. All are welcome." Mark hesitated at the door. He had walked past this place a dozen times in the last week, but never gone in. Something in him resisted. Maybe pride, maybe fear, maybe the idea that entering this space meant he was finally one of them, whoever they were. But the cold in his bones and the silence of his phone left him no noble choices. So he stepped in. The smell of stew hit him first, then the sound of low conversation, plastic chairs scraping tile, and someone playing soft gospel music from a speaker in the corner. A woman with silver hair and a sweatshirt that said, "Hope Volunteer," greeted him at the door. "Hi there," she said kindly. "You knew?" Mark nodded, unsure what to say. "No pressure," she smiled. "Dinner starts in 15. You can grab a seat, and if you'd like, we have a short devotional at 5:45. Nothing heavy, just some verses and time to breathe." Then she handed him something small. A name tag. Blank, with a blue Sharpie tied to a string. He held it for a moment. Just cardboard and ink. But it felt heavier than it should have. What name do you write when you feel like you've lost who you are. He hadn't been Mark the manager in months, not Mark with the condo or Mark from accounting. Now he was just Mark. And strangely, that felt enough. He wrote it slowly, each letter like an act of courage. M-A-R-K. Then he peeled the sticker and pressed it over his chest, just above the place that had started to feel again. The devotional was simple. A young man read Psalm 34 aloud. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Mark looked down at his hands. They were shaking a little. He hadn't cried since the day he got fired. Back then, the tears came from fear. But now they came from something else, from the shock of being seen, from the ache of hearing truth spoken exactly to where he hurt, from the unbearable kindness of being welcomed without needing to prove anything. Dinner was rice and stew with cornbread. Hot, messy, delicious. He ate slowly, listening to the buzz of conversation around him. Stories of lost jobs, lost homes, lost love. But in every voice, he heard something deeper, people who were still trying, still hoping, still showing up, not because they had to, but because deep down, they believed there had to be more than this pain. As Mark scraped the last of the stew from his bowl, the volunteer passed by again. "You doing okay?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm still here," he said quietly. She smiled gently. Sometimes that's the holiest thing you can say. And in that little shelter, with a name tag on his chest and cornbread crumbs on his plate, Mark felt it again. Not answers, not success, but presence. God wasn't waiting for him to fix his life. He had already stepped into the wreckage, sat down beside him, and whispered, "I still know your name." Mark came back the next day, not because anything had changed in his circumstances, but because something had started to shift inside him. It wasn't hope yet. It wasn't peace. It was something simpler. Hunger, not just for food, but for warmth, for connection, for meaning. The shelter opened at 6 p.m., but he came early this time. He didn't want to be rushed. Something about the space felt safe, not like a church exactly, but sacred in a different way. A man in a red flannel shirt was setting out chairs. He nodded at Mark and gestured toward a large silver urn near the back. "Coffee's fresh." Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it felt too generous, too normal. But then he walked over, filled a paper cup, and sat in the far corner. It was bitter, a little burnt, but it was hot, and it was free. And for a man who had measured every cent of his life for the last 3 months, free was a kind of grace. As he sat sipping, the room slowly filled. A woman named Teresa, who wore 3 jackets and talked to herself in whispers. A man named Leo, who always saved half his bread roll for later. 2 teenagers who didn't speak but stayed close to each other like shadows. Mark didn't know their stories, but he didn't need to. Their eyes told him enough. They were tired. They were human. They were trying. The same volunteer from yesterday, Clara, he now knew her name, walked past his table and paused. "Mind if I sit?" Mark nodded, moving his cup to make space. She didn't ask about his job, or his past, or his family. She just sat. And in a world that often wants to fix you or label you, someone sitting beside you without needing an explanation, that felt holy. After a few quiet sips, she said, "You know, God doesn't need you to be strong right now." Mark looked up. She smiled gently. "He just wants you to be honest." He nodded slowly, staring into his coffee. "I don't know how to believe anymore," he said. Clara didn't flinch. "That's okay. she replied. Sometimes believing starts with just showing up. He didn't reply, but her words sat with him like that coffee, warm, slightly bitter, but comforting. He didn't know how to pray, didn't know if he deserved help, didn't know if God even saw him. But he knew this. He was still showing up, and maybe that, too, was a kind of faith. Before he left that night, Clara handed him a second cup of coffee, this time with a lid. "Take this for the morning," she said. "Mornings are the hardest." Mark took it with quiet thanks. He didn't cry, didn't tremble. But when he stepped out into the cold, the cup warming his hands, a single phrase drifted across his mind. "God, I don't have anything to give you, but I'm here." And in the quiet of that moment, he felt no shame, only presence. Mark didn't intend to go back to his old apartment, but 3 days after his second visit to the shelter, he found himself standing in front of it again. The building hadn't changed. Same chipped paint, same flickering hallway light near the stairwell. His old unit, 206, was empty now, locked, cleared out by management. But for some reason, he just needed to see it, not to move back, not to reclaim anything, just to remember. He walked around to the back alley where the dumpster stood. It was early morning, quiet, cold, and there it was, a torn cardboard box, his name still scribbled on the side in faded black ink. It was sitting on top of the trash, unclaimed, unwanted. He pulled it down, opened it with shaking hands. Inside, old bills, bank statements, a half-used planner, and a photo frame, cracked, but still holding an image of him in a suit and tie, standing next to a Top Performer of the Year plaque. Mark sat down on the curb and held the picture for a long time. He looked into the eyes of his past self, the man who had believed success would protect him, that if he planned enough, worked hard enough, stayed ahead of the curve, he could outrun disappointment, outrun loss, outrun fear. But fear had caught him. Loss had knocked. And he had been left empty. He set the frame aside and pulled out the stack of bills. Some had red stamps across the top. Final notice. Others had been opened, then stuffed back in without action. He didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, he whispered, "I forgive you." It wasn't a prayer. Not quite. More like a surrender. He said it to the man he used to be. The one who panicked when the first paycheck didn't come. The one who ignored warning signs. The one who let pride keep him from asking for help. "I forgive you for not being perfect. I forgive you for falling. I forgive you because God hasn't left you." He stuffed the rest of the papers back in the box, but not the photo. That he tucked carefully into the front pocket of his backpack, not as a trophy, not as shame, but as a reminder that the man in the photo wasn't more valuable than the one sitting here on the curb. That identity was never meant to be built on job titles or credit scores. That the God who loves the broken doesn't start loving you when you succeed. He starts whispering when you can't. As Mark stood to leave, he noticed something scrawled in Sharpie on the side of the dumpster. It simply read, "Mercy waits here." He smiled, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. Mark was back at the shelter again, 4 nights in a row now. He no longer felt the quiet dread he used to carry when walking through the door. It wasn't home, not exactly, but it was a place where the world slowed down, where he didn't have to perform, or fix, or explain. Just breathe, just be. That evening's meal was simple: pasta and salad with stale dinner rolls and chocolate pudding cups that brought quiet smiles to every table. Teresa, the woman with the whispering jacket, offered him an extra roll. He took it, nodding his thanks. Afterward, the volunteers opened the small back chapel, just a converted storage room with folding chairs and a string of dim fairy lights tacked along the ceiling. Some people stayed for warmth, others stayed for the silence, and some came to cry in peace. Mark sat in the last row, arms crossed over his chest, unsure why he stayed. He told himself it was just for the heat, but he knew better. At the front, a teenage girl, barely 18, stood with a cracked acoustic guitar. She wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big and had short cropped hair dyed a fading blue. She didn't introduce herself, didn't say much at all. She just played a simple, unpolished melody. Her voice trembled in the beginning, but steadied as she sang, "You don't have to earn it. You don't have to run. He sits in your silence and calls you his son." Mark froze, not because of her voice, not even because of the lyrics, but because something in the words, raw and unfiltered, felt like they had been written for him, as if God had sent the message through the one person no one would have expected. A scared, blue-haired girl who had probably lost her own share of things. You don't have to fix it. He's not keeping score. The less that you carry, the more he adores. Mark bowed his head. His throat tightened. Tears didn't fall. Not yet. But his chest ached with something he hadn't felt in months. Longing. Not just for security, not even for answers, but for a love that didn't flinch when it saw his scars. A love that stayed when there was nothing left to admire. When the music ended, no one clapped. Not out of rudeness, but reverence. The room stayed quiet. A few sniffles. A cough. Then silence. Mark closed his eyes and whispered in his heart, "God, if you really see me, I don't need you to fix it all. Just don't let go of me." He didn't know if that counted as a prayer, but it felt like one. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Mark woke early and walked. It had become a sort of ritual, wandering the blocks around the shelter before the city fully opened its eyes. The streets were still quiet then. Less traffic, less noise, and somehow less pressure to look like he belonged. He passed shuttered storefronts, half-lit diners, and a bus stop where a man in a torn coat was arguing with no one. Mark kept his distance, nodded once, and moved on. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, he found himself sitting outside a small community library. It was closed, but there was a bench, and he sat there, watching people go by. Some in suits, some in scrubs, some in clothes like his. A young man, barely 20, came walking up the sidewalk, dragging a battered duffel bag behind him. The zipper was half broken, and clothes spilled from the side like a wound. He looked tired, not just in body, but in soul. The way you can tell someone's been carrying too much for too long. As he passed, the duffel snagged on a crack in the sidewalk, tearing open completely. Socks, shirts, a notebook, and a small, worn Bible tumbled to the ground. He let out a frustrated sigh and just stood there, looking at the mess. Mark didn't think. He just stood, stepped forward, and knelt down beside the bag. "Let me help." The young man blinked, surprised. "It's fine, I got it." Mark didn't move. "Let me help anyway." Together, they gathered the clothes. Mark offered a small plastic grocery bag he'd kept folded in his jacket pocket. It wasn't much, but it helped. As they stood, the young man nodded once. "Thanks." Mark just smiled. "We all need a hand sometimes." The kid hesitated, then said, "You at the shelter?" Mark nodded. Me too. Just got in last night. They stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then Mark spoke again. They do coffee at 6. Strong, terrible stuff. But it's warm. The kid cracked a smile. That sounds like a miracle. They walked the next few blocks together in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence you share with someone who understands the ache without needing details. That night, over soup and bread, Mark saw the young man again, now sitting at a table in the corner, eating slowly, eyes softening just enough to let warmth in. And something in Mark felt anchored. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, he had helped someone else, without a paycheck, without a plan, without expectation, just out of presence, just out of being there. And maybe, he thought, that's what grace really looks like, not solving everything, but carrying the bag when it rips. As he sipped his coffee later that night, Mark whispered into his cup, "Thank you, not for fixing me, but for using me, even like this." And he smiled, because for the first time in months, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a man becoming whole again. A week passed, 7 quiet, slow-moving days, where nothing dramatic happened. And yet, somehow, Mark felt more alive than he had in months. He still didn't have a job, still slept in the back of the shelter when there was space, still counted coins before buying a granola bar. But something in him had shifted. Where despair had once ruled, a different rhythm had settled in. A rhythm of showing up, of listening, of simply being present. He had started helping the volunteers clean up after dinner. It wasn't official. No one asked. He just stayed after everyone else had left, collected trays, wiped tables, and stacked chairs. It gave his hands something to do, and strangely, his heart something to rest on. One night, after most people had gone, Clara, his now familiar friend in the Hope volunteer sweatshirt, handed him a leftover dinner roll wrapped in a napkin. "Take this," she said. "It's still warm." He nodded his thanks and sat down on the edge of the serving counter to eat it. Clara stood across from him, sipping tea from a chipped mug. They didn't speak for a while. But then, as Mark tore a piece of bread in half, she said softly, "You know, Jesus broke bread too." He looked up. Her eyes were tired, but kind. He didn't multiply it until he first broke it. Mark stared at the roll in his hand. "Are you saying I had to be broken first?" Clara smiled gently. "I'm saying, sometimes it's only after we break that we can feed others." She paused. "You've been feeding people, Mark. You might not see it, but I do." He didn't know what to say. He looked down, blinked once, and took another bite of the bread. It was soft, slightly sweet, humble, ordinary. And yet her words hung in the air like incense. Broken things feed hungry people. Was it possible that all the pieces of his life that had shattered, his pride, his career, his plans, were not wasted? That maybe, just maybe, God wasn't rebuilding him into who he used to be, but into someone entirely new? He sat there for a long time after she left, watching the steam rise from the sink, feeling the ache of transformation, not loud or flashy, but slow and sacred. He thought about Jesus breaking bread with the disciples, about how he knew he was about to be betrayed, and still chose to offer himself. And suddenly, Mark realized something. He had spent his whole life trying not to break. But maybe, just maybe, the breaking was where the miracle began. He finished the roll in silence, and with it, a part of his old self was quietly laid to rest. Not mourned, just released. That night, under a wool blanket and a flickering hallway light, Mark didn't ask for rescue. He simply whispered, "If you can use the broken, then here I am," and fell asleep with a full heart. It started with a broom. Clara was short-staffed one morning at the shelter. Someone had called out sick. Breakfast was behind, and a line was forming at the door. Mark had shown up early, hoping to sit in the quiet before the rush. But instead, Clara handed him a broom and said, with a wink, "Think you can be our floor manager today?" He grinned despite himself. "Depends on the salary and benefits." She laughed. "You get all the lukewarm coffee you want." So he swept. First the hallway, then the dining area, then the side entry where footprints tracked in slush and city dust. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. But it was needed. And more than that, it felt good. Not because he was being noticed, but because for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. Later, he helped pass out toast and oatmeal. The regulars had started to greet him now, not just as another guy in the line, but as someone who belonged. Leo, the man who saved his bread rolls, nodded at him and said, "You're part of the place now." Mark chuckled, surprised by how much that meant. After breakfast, as he was wiping down tables, a young woman with 2 children came through the door. She looked exhausted. Her kids clung to her coat sleeves. Their shoes were wet, their eyes wary. Without thinking, Mark stepped toward them and held the door open with a smile. She paused, then nodded gratefully. Clara walked by behind him and whispered, "You have no idea how powerful that was." He looked confused. She continued, "You didn't just open a door. You told her she was seen. That matters more than you think." The rest of the day passed like that. Small, forgettable acts that somehow added up to something sacred. A mop bucket, a coffee refill, a moment of listening. Mark realized he wasn't waiting for his old life to return anymore. He was building a new one, not in grand steps, but in quiet faithfulness. That evening, sitting on the steps of the same church he had once cried in front of, Mark watched the sky fade from blue to gold. His hands were rough now, his jeans worn at the knees, but his heart was steady. He remembered a verse he hadn't thought of in years. "Whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God." Even sweeping, even holding doors, even offering a quiet presence when no one else could. He whispered, "Is this what redemption feels like? Not fireworks, not applause. Just a quiet return to being who he was always meant to be. A man who didn't need a title to serve. A man who didn't need applause to love. A man who could finally breathe without proving his worth." As the sun dipped below the buildings, Mark stood, stretched, and smiled. He had no resume, no salary, no clear future. But somehow, in this quiet moment with God, he felt rich. It came in the most ordinary way. A folded flyer, half tucked into the bulletin board at the shelter's entrance. Most days, Mark would have passed it without a second glance. But that morning, something about the words caught his eye. Hiring, dishwasher, morning shift, local cafe. Apply in person. There was nothing flashy about it. No benefits package, no salary range listed. Just an address, a time, and a note. Experience helpful, but not required. Mark stared at it longer than he meant to. Not because it was his dream job. It wasn't. But because he hadn't considered looking again. Not really. He had settled into the rhythm of the shelter. The comfort of familiar faces. The dignity of small acts of service, the unexpected grace that had started to grow like green shoots in cracked pavement. Was he ready to step out of that? Later that day, Clara caught him staring at the flyer again. You thinking about it? He hesitated, then nodded. Good, she said. But don't think for too long. Mark raised an eyebrow. You trying to get rid of me? Clara smirked. I'm trying to remind you that healing is for moving forward, not staying still. This place is a hospital, Mark, not a hiding place. The next morning, Mark stood outside the cafe. It was small, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. The windows fogged from the warmth inside. Through the glass, he saw someone refilling a sugar jar, another wiping down tables. He almost walked away. His shoes were still worn, his jeans still frayed. The lie whispered again, You're not ready. You're not enough. You'll mess this up too. But then he remembered something Clara had once said. God doesn't wait until we feel ready. He walks with us into the fear. So he took a deep breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The air smelled like coffee and cinnamon. A bell above the door chimed softly. Behind the counter, a woman with gray-streaked hair and bright eyes looked up. Looking for coffee? She asked. Mark smiled nervously. Actually, I'm here about the dishwasher job. Her face lit up. You're the first one who's come in. You got experience. Some, he said honestly. And I know how to show up on time. She laughed. That's already more than half the battle. Can you start tomorrow? Mark blinked. Seriously? She nodded. You'll be washing more than dishes some days, but we're a team. If you're willing to work, we're glad to have you. As he left the cafe, job start time scribbled on a napkin in his pocket. Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope, not the kind built on a paycheck, but the kind born from knowing God had not just rescued him, he was rebuilding him. That night, as he lay under his usual blanket at the shelter one final time, he whispered into the darkness, Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I did. And sleep came gently, like peace pulling a man back from the edge and placing his feet on new ground. The coffee kitchen was hot, loud, and smelled perpetually of eggs, grease, and something faintly sweet. Maybe vanilla. Mark's station was tucked in the back, behind the swinging doors, near the sink that never seemed to be empty. His first morning was rough. The breakfast rush came fast and hard. Plates piled high, syrup sticking to silverware, mugs clinking as they were dropped into the wash bin. No one really had time for introductions, but no one ignored him either. The head cook, a big man named Jules, with a stained apron and a heart too big for his chest, grunted as he passed by. You're doing good, man. Fast hands matter more than fancy resumes. Mark didn't say much, just nodded, rolled up his sleeves, and kept scrubbing. His palms stung from the hot water. His back ached from leaning over the sink. But inside, something felt right. Not easy, but right. During the mid-morning lull, Mark took his first real break. He sat on an overturned bucket near the back door, sipping burnt coffee and staring out at the alleyway. The wind was cold, but he didn't mind. He had a job, a small paycheck waiting, and more than that, a reason to wake up again. Clara had once told him that work wasn't about status, it was about meaning. You could sweep floors for the kingdom of God, she'd said, and it would still echo in eternity. Mark hadn't believed her back then, but now, with dish soap on his fingers and exhaustion in his bones, he smiled to himself, because somehow, through rinsing plates, wiping spills, and remembering to breathe, He did feel close to God. Before he left that day, the cafe owner caught him at the sink. "Hey," she said, "I meant to tell you earlier. Thanks for jumping in. Most new hires flake out in 2 days. You? You showed up." Mark looked up, surprised. "Thanks for giving me a shot," she nodded. "We don't hire resumes here. We hire people who need a fresh start." On the way back to the shelter that night, Mark stopped by a dollar store. With the few dollars he had left, he bought something small, a pocket-sized notebook. He sat on the edge of his cot that evening and opened it to the first page and wrote, "Day 1, I washed dishes. God was there." He closed the book, set it beside his backpack, and lay down with a heart quietly full. He hadn't climbed a mountain. He hadn't turned his life around overnight, but he had taken a step, and in that step, he felt the weight of something sacred, not just surviving, but beginning again. The job was going well. 3 weeks in, and Mark hadn't missed a single shift. The cafe team had started calling him Dish Boss, and Jules, the cook, left him a sticky note every Friday with dumb jokes like, "Why did the tomato blush?" "Because it saw the salad dressing." Jules. They made him laugh more than he cared to admit. He was even saving a little, keeping change in a plastic bag tucked in his backpack, hoping soon to afford a small room somewhere. Just a bed and a door that locked. Nothing fancy. But then the call came. His phone had been off for months, buried at the bottom of his bag. But Clara had helped him find a cheap prepaid SIM last week. "Just in case," she said. He didn't expect to hear from anyone, which is why his hand shook when he saw the number. No name. Just digits. Familiar ones. He answered. "Mark?" It was his sister. They hadn't spoken since their father's funeral. Years ago. Not after the business failure. Not after he stopped returning calls. Not after he fell off the map. She didn't sound angry, just cautious. "I heard you were in a tough place. One of Mom's friends saw your name on a church prayer list." Mark's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. She continued gently. "Would you let me take you to lunch?" Mark met her the next day. Same smile, same eyes, same habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when nervous. They didn't talk about everything. Not yet. But they did talk about the past, and about pain, and about how silence between family doesn't always mean absence. She offered help, a couch, a short-term stay, a fresh start. And that's when the fear came roaring back. What if I mess it up again? What if I let her down? What if I'm not ready? That night, Mark sat on the church steps again. The same ones he'd cried on weeks earlier. Only now, the tears were different. Not from despair, but from overwhelm. Because sometimes, when you've lived in lack long enough, abundance feels like a trap. He whispered, "God, what if I can't handle grace?" The night wind didn't answer, but a line from one of the devotionals floated up in his memory. "Fear not, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God." Isaiah 41:10. He took a breath. Not everything had to be decided tonight, but this much he knew. He wasn't the same man who had run before. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to run this time. He opened his notebook and wrote, Day 23. Fear came knocking again, but I didn't open the door. God sat with me until it passed. Mark stood in front of the house. It was smaller than he remembered. His sister's front yard was neatly trimmed, a small ceramic angel tucked under the mailbox. The porch light flickered slightly. He held his breath. He wasn't here because he was desperate anymore. He wasn't here because he needed rescuing. He was here because something inside him whispered, "It's time." She greeted him with a soft smile and open arms. There were no speeches, no awkward questions, no unpacking of old wounds, just a quiet, "It's good to see you," and a hug that said more than words could. He stayed for dinner. She made spaghetti, their mother's old recipe. The smell alone brought tears to his eyes. They laughed about childhood memories. They sat in silence when it got too heavy. And when she offered the spare room upstairs, Mark didn't protest. He simply nodded and whispered, "Thank you." That night, lying on clean sheets in a quiet room, he stared at the ceiling. He missed the shelter, not the noise, not the discomfort, but the people, the unspoken understanding, the way God had met him there, not in perfection, but in broken bread, cold mornings, and whispered scripture. He realized something he hadn't before. The shelter wasn't the miracle. God was, and God had come with him. In the morning, Mark left a note on the small desk in the room. "I'll help with rent soon. I'm not here to take. I'm here to build." Then he packed his bag and headed to work at the cafe. Same shift, same sink. But now, a different man stood behind it. Jules noticed something. "You look taller today," he joked. "Finally sleeping on a real mattress." Mark laughed. "Something like that." He scrubbed plates with a strange new energy, not because life was perfect, not because he had arrived, but because he was becoming. He wasn't ashamed of where he had been. He wasn't afraid of what was ahead, because now he carried something stronger than certainty. Peace, not the kind that comes from answered prayers, but the kind that comes from knowing, even when I had nothing, God was enough. It had been 2 months since Mark started washing dishes. The work was still hard. His hands still dried out from soap and heat. He still got tired, but something had changed. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was living. And more than that, he was giving. One quiet Thursday, after the morning rush had slowed, Mark noticed a new hire, Darren. Early 20s, quiet, nervous. He dropped a tray of spoons in the first 10 minutes and nearly apologized himself into the floor. Mark pulled him aside and smiled. "First day?" Darren nodded quickly. Mark handed him a towel and said, "We've all dropped stuff. You'll be fine." It was a small gesture, but Darren's face lit up like someone had given him permission to breathe. That night, back at his sister's house, Mark pulled out his notebook. Day 62. Someone else was scared today. God let me be the voice I once needed. He paused, then underlined it. Maybe healing isn't just what God does for us. It's what he does through us. The next week, he stopped by the shelter on his day off. Not to sleep, not to eat, but to serve. He helped Clara organize pantry shelves, talked with Leo, shared coffee with the same blue-haired girl who once sang that trembling song about God's love. And when a tired man with sunken eyes and an army jacket walked through the door, looking exactly how Mark had once felt, Mark walked up, smiled, and said, "You're safe here. Let me get you some coffee." He didn't quote scripture, didn't preach. He just stayed. He just listened. And as the man slowly began to talk, Mark saw it clearly. The same God who had met him in the dark was now reaching someone else through his hands, his voice, his story. He left that day with empty pockets, but a full heart, and he remembered the verse that used to haunt him in the middle of his worst nights. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Now, it didn't haunt him, it held him, because weakness no longer meant failure. It meant space for mercy to move in. It had been 3 months now. Mark no longer kept track of the days like a countdown. He still carried his notebook, but instead of writing just survival notes, he began recording moments of grace, not big events, not life-changing revelations, just faithful things. A sunrise he saw on the walk to work, a coworker who brought him a muffin just because, a small laugh shared with a stranger at the bus stop, a prayer whispered in the cafe's walk-in freezer when the noise of life got too loud. One Thursday evening, Clara invited him to speak at the shelter's small support group. He hesitated. "I'm not a pastor," he said. "I'm not even qualified to give advice." She smiled. "You don't need a title, Mark. Just tell the truth about what God did when you thought everything was over." That night, he stood in front of 10 people, some slouched in their chairs, some staring blankly, others curled into themselves like armor. Mark didn't preach. He just said, "I lost everything. And I thought I had lost God too. But it turns out, He never lost me." He shared about the shelter, about the coffee, the cracked photo frame, the blue-haired girl with the guitar, the cracked plate he broke on his first cafe shift, the night he almost walked away, and the moment he didn't. He told them that healing didn't come all at once, that sometimes grace doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like someone handing you a paper towel when you spill your tray. When he finished, no one clapped. But no one looked away either. And when a quiet man in the back raised his hand and whispered, "How did you know he still loved you?" Mark answered without thinking, "Because I didn't stop waking up, and he kept showing up in the small things." That night, walking home under a sky full of stars, Mark didn't feel like a former failure or a survivor. He felt like a man becoming. He didn't have it all figured out, but he knew this: a life rebuilt with God is not made in giant leaps, but in small, sacred steps. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, Day 78. I spoke for the first time, not as the man I used to be, but as the man God is still forming. He paused, then added, and I didn't need to be enough, because he is. It happened on a Tuesday. The cafe was slow, so Mark had the afternoon off. He decided to stop by the bookstore next door, just to browse, not to buy. His budget was still tight. He wandered through the aisles, pausing at the section marked Leadership and Business. A familiar ache surfaced in his chest. He had spent years in rooms like this, hungry for success, devouring books that promised influence, optimization, 7-step systems to stay ahead. Back then, he'd believed productivity would make him whole. He almost turned away, but something caught his eye. Tucked inside a book on corporate reinvention was a business card, slightly bent, with gold lettering. It bore the logo of his old firm. His name was still on it. He picked it up and stared at it. His full name. Title, Regional Director. Phone, email. The version of himself that once felt untouchable. And suddenly, it was all there again. The pride, the drive, the collapse. He slipped the card into his pocket, not out of nostalgia, but as a quiet reminder. Then he walked across the store to the spiritual life shelf and picked up a worn, secondhand devotional. Inside the front cover was a handwritten note. To whoever finds this, you are not your resume. You are not your worst mistake. You are deeply loved. Estaki. Mark smiled, heart catching in his throat. Was it coincidence? Was it divine appointment? He didn't know, but he did know this. The man who once measured his worth and status now carried peace and silence. That night, he took out the business card and laid it on the desk next to his notebook. And he wrote, Day 83. Today, I saw who I used to be. I didn't despise him, but I didn't want to be him again. He folded the card in half, then in half again, until it fit inside the back cover of the devotional. Then he whispered, "Thank you, God, for not making me go back, but for walking me forward, step by step." Healing wasn't erasing the past. It was walking beside it, hand in hand with grace. And tonight, Mark felt that grace in full. It was raining. The morning, Darren didn't show up to the cafe. Mark noticed immediately. No clattering trays. No nervous muttering about butter knives. No oversized hoodie trailing through puddles. He waited until the breakfast rush slowed, then called Clara at the shelter. "Yeah," she said quietly. "He's here. Didn't want to come in. Said he didn't matter enough to bother." Mark grabbed his jacket. He found Darren sitting on the back steps of the shelter, drenched, head in his hands. Mark didn't ask what happened. Didn't lecture. He just sat beside him. For a long time, neither spoke. Rain dripped from the awning. The alley was quiet except for the hum of early traffic. Finally, Darren whispered, "I messed up again." Mark nodded slowly. "Okay." The younger man looked up, confused. "That's it? No guilt trip?" "No," Mark said. "You already gave yourself one. I've been there." He took a breath. "But I can tell you this. Messing up doesn't mean it's over." Darren wiped his eyes with a sleeve. "You really believe that?" Mark looked him straight in the face. "I'm living that." Later that night, Mark wrote in his notebook, Day 90. "Rain again today. But I saw a younger version of me on the shelter steps, and I didn't run from him. I sat down beside him." Maybe that's how you heal the world, Lord. Not by lifting us out, but by sitting in the rain with us until we believe we're not alone. That evening, as Mark walked back to his sister's house, the street lamps flickered on one by one. The pavement shimmered with puddles, but he didn't avoid them. He walked straight through, because these days, the storms didn't scare him anymore. They reminded him of where he met God. He thought of something Clara had said once. Your story isn't just what happened to you. It's what you do with it. And Mark smiled, because he was finally doing something with it, not for applause, not for validation, but because God didn't rescue him just to survive. He rescued him so others could see that rescue is possible. The cafe was hosting its first community night. Nothing fancy, just coffee, donated pastries, some folding chairs, and an open mic for music or stories. Jules had decorated the back wall with string lights. Clara brought flyers. Mark helped set up the chairs. He hadn't planned on speaking, but when Clara tapped his shoulder and said, "Maybe just a few words?" he didn't say no. When it was his turn, Mark stood up slowly, hands in pockets, heart steady. He looked out at the small crowd, shelter guests, cafe regulars, old friends. Darren was there, hoodie pulled low. His sister sat in the back, next to Leo. Even the blue-haired girl with the guitar had come. He cleared his throat. "I used to think losing everything was the worst thing that could happen to me." He paused. "But the worst thing was believing that because I lost everything, I was nothing." People nodded, quietly, slowly. Mark continued, "I came to the end of myself with nothing left to offer. Not money, not success, not answers. And it was there, in that cold, quiet place, that God didn't just rescue me. He redefined me. I found out I didn't have to earn love. I didn't have to climb my way back to grace. I just had to stop running long enough to let him sit beside me. He looked out over the room, faces tearful, hopeful, soft. If you're here tonight and you feel like your story is too messy, too broken, too far gone, let me tell you, you are exactly where miracles begin. He stepped down in silence, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt sacred. Later that night, after the chairs had been stacked and the last mugs washed, Mark sat alone at a small table, the string light still glowing faintly above. He opened his notebook, the last page, and he wrote, Day 100. I started this journal thinking I had lost everything, but tonight I see it differently. I didn't lose everything. I lost the things that were never going to hold me, and in their place, God gave me a new life, a quiet one, a real one I never knew I needed. He closed the notebook, folded his hands, and whispered, Thank you, God, for becoming enough. You always were. I just had to be empty enough to see it. And outside, the night sky shimmered, not with fireworks, not with thunder, but with quiet stars, the kind you only notice after the noise fades.